Well, good morning, everyone. I am really excited to be here. Thank you so much to the students and the faculty at Gordon for welcoming me so warmly. It's been a great day yesterday, and I look forward to today and hopefully to seeing a lot of you at lunch with us later this afternoon. As was said, I lead an organization called the Expectations Project, and our main focus is to really mobilize and equip faith-based communities to take a stand on educational equity, particularly in our nation's public schools, because that's where the majority of kids are, and certainly the majority of kids from low-income communities are in public schools as opposed to private or parochial schools or being homeschooled. I want to spend some time today certainly talking about educational equity, but I want to also frame it in a larger context. And at our organization, we spend so much time sort of laser focused on the education system, and we talk a lot about what policies we want to advocate for and how to, build really great partnerships between churches and public schools. But we also would be remiss if we didn't think about the larger context that's affecting public schools and some of the challenges that families often growing up in poverty may have, because that is often at the root of what we're wrestling with. And so we spend some time thinking about this idea of purpose and privilege. And how do we really ensure that all of God's children can identify their own purpose? And for those of us that perhaps have a bit more privilege in our society, what does this mean in terms of how we think about purpose and what our responsibility is to help those who are perhaps more disenfranchised in our nation? So that's where we're going to focus today. And so I want to start with a Bible verse that we're all incredibly familiar with. It's one of my favorites. I'm sure we all have it committed to memory. It's Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And you can literally walk into any Christian bookstore and find this Bible verse emblazoned on posters, on knickknacks. Your grandma may have it cross-stitched, hanging somewhere over her fireplace in her house. You might have it on a bookmark in your dorm room right now. It's a very, very common verse. And it usually has some type of photo that associated with it that looks like this, right? It has, mountains in the background and never-ending boundaries of land, sun breaking at just the right angle, perhaps a rainbow, a unicorn, whatever it is that we look for that makes us feel that it's this wonderful idea. And really, what is it, though, about this verse that has such resonance with so many of us? On one hand, it's because it has these core themes of prosperity, hope, and future, the three words there. And these are absolutely central ideas, I believe, to what it means to be human, but also central to our understanding of our relationship with God. But I think we also resonate with Jeremiah 29:11 because for many of us, our personal context or what we're desiring for prosperity, hope, and a future may look something like this. Now, it might not be exactly these people. They look a little Stepfordish, I get that. Some of us might want a couple with a little more melanin in their skin to represent us. But the idea, for me anyway, is this notion of just absolute prosperity and happiness, right? I mean, if God's prosperity and providence for me involves anything with a warm, sunny beach and a cold beverage, sign me up, I'm there. But I think this idea, when we sort of extrapolate it a bit further, is, if we're really honest, isn't there some degree to how we measure God's blessing in terms of prosperity, hope, and a future about what we have and what we actually seek to attain in our lives? And it could be a lot of different things for many of us. Some of us, it may be, I want sort of that perfect family, 2.5 kids and a Cocker Spaniel, resting on the hearth in front of our roaring fireplace. It may be, a great house in the suburbs, a Volvo, whatever it is that for you represents prosperity. And I think it's this whole idea of the American dream that often connects us to this verse, particularly because it's our own context. And now, none of those things in and of themselves are wrong. But I think it's also important for us to pause and ask ourselves, how does my particular context distort our reading of this passage, which is so much about purpose, right? And how does it betray some of our assumptions about God's hand of purpose and blessing in our lives? And these are some important questions that we really do want to wrestle with. And so when breaking this down a little bit further and thinking about our own context, for those of us here at Gordon, which I'm a guest at Gordon today, what is that context? And what are some of the things that we have that perhaps others may not have? One big piece of that is privilege. And I know this can be an awkward notion to talk about, but we have to be honest with ourselves that simply because we're here at a college, we have privilege. right? There are millions of people in our country who are never going to get to this place. Even if your personal background isn't one from privilege, the fact of the matter is, like it or not, by the time you leave here with your degree, which I'm sure all of you will get that degree, you are going to be more privileged than the vast majority of people in the United States. And there's something that comes along with that. In this process of being at this wonderful institution, you have even more privilege while you're here. It may not feel like it all the time, but you do. And that's partly because you have the luxury of doing what we're doing now. We're having this sort of meta conversation. We're talking about, what is purpose? What is privilege? What does this mean for God's hand on my life? There are so many people who don't have the luxury of even coming together in a setting like Gordon and having the types of conversations you're having. Right? If you're worried about trying to meet, rent every month, or you're worried about how to feed your kids, having a broader discussion about purpose and privilege and what does Jeremiah 29:11 actually mean to my life just may take on a very different meaning in that context rather than the one we're in now. And one of the key things that I think privilege leads a lot of us to have access to, so it certainly gives us access, right? It gives us connections and relationship that are hopefully going to be beneficial to us for the rest of our lives, but it also gives us the ability to choose. And I would submit to you all that that is a significant part of what privilege actually is when you think about the connections to purpose. If you have options and you can sort of decide, do I want to go and focus on international affairs? Do I want to do something domestic? Maybe law school? Maybe I want to be a journalist? That's, again, a certain type of privilege because you have the ability to choose, to some extent, your purpose and destiny, seeking God's wisdom for that. And so I want to think about, what does this verse mean and in terms of identifying our purpose if we don't come from privilege? And again, I know some of us come from different backgrounds here at this school, but given that we're here, we have some privilege now. But let's really talk about this morning, for the next few minutes, the 16 million kids that are growing up in poverty in our country. That's 22% of our nation's kids are living below the poverty line. 22% of them, 16 million kids. How do we reclaim the promise of Jeremiah 29:11 for those children? How do we help them tap into these wonderful themes in this verse of prosperity, hope, and future for their lives? I want to offer a fairly simple framework that we believe at the Expectations Project is pretty powerful for thinking about how we help the next generation of young people, particularly those from disadvantaged or disenfranchised, I like to say, backgrounds, identify their calling and their purpose. A few things. The first, family support. I think all of us can look back on our own experiences and recognize places where we may have had more family support than others. And this doesn't necessarily mean the sort of nuclear family. You may have grown up in a single-parent home, raised by your grandparents, aunts, uncles, whomever. But it really is this idea that someone in your family earlier in your life, and someone that you're in relationship with, however you define family, is going to provide you with the love and the encouragement and the care to be the person that God designed you to be. That has to be in place for us in order to help get on the path to purpose. The second thing is self-esteem, and this is not sort of self-esteem in the go to the self-help book aisle and repeat affirmations that I am wonderful. It's really not about that, right? You can do that if you want to help yourself. But this really is about helping everyone understand that they have value. And again, particularly for young people who may have been historically marginalized or disenfranchised, helping them understand that piece is really key. Particularly if you live in a society where the images that you see of yourself are often negative ones, whether it's in the media, on the news, or you don't see images that look like you at all in leadership positions in your life, that can have a pretty significant impact on how you view yourself. When I taught fifth grade in Compton, I literally had students, when I started working with them, and we brought in tutors and mentors to work with them because so many of them were so far behind academically, I literally had kids say, Miss Baker, don't waste your time with me because I'm just not smart. Maybe go and work with those kids over there, or maybe you should go to another school and work with other kids, but here, I'm not smart. I'm not gonna be worth you investing the time in. And for students to have made that decision about themselves at such an early age is devastating. These were 10-year-olds who literally didn't think that that was part of their plan. I remember having a conversation with kids who asked me in my fifth grade class, Miss Baker, didn't you go to, this was sort of, after school, kids just get really comfortable and casual. And, one of them said, didn't you go to a really good school, a good college, didn't you? And I was like, well, I went to a good school. I liked it in Michigan, go Blue. But they were like, so why did you come and work here? couldn't you have gotten a job anywhere else? I mean, this was literally a question they were asking sort of in front of, kids after school. And I said, well, the reason I came here is because I heard like the best and smartest kids were in Compton, which was sort of my, 22-year-old mind's way of trying to, push their sort of self-esteem. And the kids got quiet for a minute and they just busted out laughing at me. They were like, okay, Ms. Baker, really? Like, why did you think that? They were like, clearly we're not the smartest kids because you can just look at our school. We don't have enough books. We don't have enough desks in our classroom. There's no toilet paper in the bathrooms. The school's windows are broken. I mean, they went on a litany of things that from their determination and their understanding would suggest that no one thought they were smart, because why would they have been given a school like this? And so again, when we're looking for frameworks to provide kids a path to purpose, if there's a context where children are really struggling to either, again, see people that look like them, feel valued, or even think that anyone beyond their community thinks anything valuable of them, that's something that we have to really push against. The third piece here is education, which I will go into a little bit more in depth since that's obviously my passion area in a couple of moments. But, the key here, the connection to purpose, for me, and I'll illustrate by sharing another story, we have to ensure that kids have a quality education so they can help tap into what some of their strengths and talents are. And if you're not educated at a high level, it's incredibly hard to find your purpose. If your God-given purpose or destiny is to be an engineer, but you're going to a school where they graduate kids from high school doing math at the level of a 7th or 8th grader, which is the average for low-income high schools, 7th or 8th grade math, you're no way going to be on the path to becoming an engineer. It's probably not going to happen. I had a student that I taught who we did a lot of, in our history class in 5th grade, we did a lot of debates. Honestly, if you're going in education, debating is a great way to help kids talk about the different issues in historical context. We did debates on everything, from the Civil War, American Revolution. And I had one student who I'll call Anthony, and he was a master debater. I'd never seen anything like it, honestly, probably to this day. And he had such an ability to get his points so concise, he could absolutely anticipate what the other side was going to say, and he would prepare his rebuttal in advance. He was so good at this, it got to the point when we were sort of lining up for the debate, and they would sort of count ahead and see who they're debating against. They were like, okay, I'm out. I'm not debating Anthony. Like, they just didn't want to debate him. He was that good. And so he and I, talked, a lot as I tried to help my students think about what their, futures might look like, and he said he really wanted to be a lawyer. Because, everyone kept saying, that's what people who debate well should become lawyers. You're a great arguer. And that idea was so wonderful for him. But the trick, though, with Anthony was that in the 5th grade in my class, he was reading at about a 1st grade level. He had so far to go to catch up. And so we certainly worked hard, and he caught up pretty dramatically. In a year, he gained about 2 grade levels, which is, not to 5th grade, but closer than he had been. But when I think about what would happen to him long term, would he have another teacher next year who'd be able to catch him up that fast again? Would he be able to be that lawyer that I think he was probably destined to be? It's really hard to imagine that as a possibility if he didn't have a high-quality education every year after that. The fourth thing is exposure to the world. I'm sure I certainly have strong memories of my mom and my dad taking us around to every possible museum, library, science show, everything to help us envision what was possible in our lives, and that's an incredibly important piece of this. And then finally, ultimately, what we all need is to have a God encounter, right? In some way that is contextual, that makes sense for us so we can identify what God's purpose may be for us. So while this framework is the ideal, we need to be realistic that not every young person in this room, let alone kids who are growing up economically disenfranchised, have all these things in place. But a person's level of privilege is often directly tied to how these things play out in their lives, if at all. And I want to zoom in just a little bit more on public education to talk about what this looks like. I shared this with some of you last night when I got a chance to speak with you in a smaller setting, but I think it bears repeating. And to really use 2 cities that are really well known to identify and just really expand on what educational inequity looks like in our nation and how it is really hindering a lot of kids from finding their purpose and their destiny. As I said, I taught in Compton, California, which is about 20 miles away from another well-known city, Beverly Hills, of 90210 fame. They're about 20 minutes apart, dramatically different in so many ways. And I think this contrast will illustrate just what the academic disparities look like and how they are really hindering so many kids from identifying their purpose. The poverty rate in Beverly Hills is only 6%. In Compton, California, 82% of the families are growing up in poverty. The racial demographics are dramatically different. 74% of families in Beverly Hills are white, and 97% of families in Compton are African American or Latino. The graduation rate, so high school graduation, 92% of kids in Beverly Hills are graduating from high school and presumably going off to college. Only 45% of kids in Compton will ever graduate from high school. 55% of them are dropping out. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at these numbers and realize that something dramatically wrong is happening here. And remember, these are not kids in private schools in Beverly Hills. These are public school comparisons to public school comparisons. And on a national level, we see the same thing. Of the kids growing up in poverty, only half of them, 50%, graduate from high school. Of the 16 million kids we've been talking about, only 1 in 10 will ever graduate from college. By the time they're in 4th grade, kids in low-income public schools are already 3 or 4 grade levels behind in math and reading by the time they're in 4th grade on the average. The average high school student graduating from a low-income public high school is doing math and reading at the level of an 8th grader. So when we think about that and how that directly impacts one's privilege and purpose, it's massive. Really what we see is this tale of 2 public education systems in our country, where one zip code often determines your academic success, but also what your purpose and your opportunities might be. So these are directly tied to these frameworks that I talked about a moment ago, and I want to come back to these because when we think about Jeremiah 29:11, we really want to think about what is our responsibility as Christians and people that are going to be future leaders. You're leaders now, but certainly your future will probably provide more leadership opportunities. How can we start to counteract some of these negative sort of frameworks that are not functioning in a full way? And I want to give you just a few examples from some of the work that we've been doing and things I've seen around the country that churches and faith communities have really stepped in to help with. The first is family support, right? So going back to that idea, everyone doesn't have the same type of family, and it doesn't mean, though, that we as a congregation and people of faith and communities can't come around and empower and support existing family structures regardless of what they may look like. And so that includes things like using schools as a way to provide social services to families. It's providing food services, opening food banks in communities, really looking at ways to support and empower parents. There's some great examples of congregations that come around, particularly single parents, and really help support them. There's a group of churches in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that was working to help with truancy for school and really got in close relationship with families, and single parents in particular with multiple children were saying, it's just literally so hard to get everyone out the door to get them to school on time. So people from these churches volunteered to come to people's houses in the morning and help get their kids ready for school and get them to school. I mean, that is really making a commitment to support the family structure, and it's just a wonderful example of the body of Christ. Self-esteem, the need for mentors in our communities is significant. We worked with a church in Indianapolis where we do a lot of work. It's an African-American church. And one of the things they wanted to do was partner with a school nearby that really was having some challenges academically and behaviorally with African-American boys in the school. And their take on this was, we're African-American men. We believe African-American boys have incredible academic potential, incredible potential to contribute to society. And so they made a commitment to go into this school, and literally they were there like 7 or 8 deep every day. And the school had a lot of disruption in the hallways. And so they said, we're just going to position ourselves in the hallways every morning and throughout every time class has changed and just shake the hands of the young men. Now, that might not seem very dramatic, but the impact it had on the school was incredible. Kids were, realizing these are people in their community, in their neighborhood that they knew, who also, by the way, knew their parents, which is always good. And so they just behaved differently, and it really brought out the best and the potential that they had. And they started, sending tutors to this school. It really just transformed the culture of the school, but also the academic outcomes. On the education front, again, there's so much that we can do. Our congregations can develop partnerships with public schools and begin tutoring and mentoring, as we've already talked about, but we can also become advocates for systemic change. And this is for our organization where we really see the potential for churches to step in. There's so many policies and systems that are in place that if we're going to dramatically change the lay of the land for education, whether it's getting more kids access to preschool or getting higher quality teachers across the board in a school district, those are not things that are necessarily going to happen just by us tutoring and mentoring. That's all good. Tutor, mentor, give food, backpack supplies. The kids need all of that, right? But we have to identify, what are one or two key issues locally or at the state level that we need to raise our voices collectively for. The church is massive. There are over 300,000 churches in this country. Please don't tell me we cannot come together and unify around an education systemic issue and make that change happen. We've seen it happen with social causes from the beginning of our history in our country, whether it's abolitionism, civil rights movement. The church has been at the forefront of those movements. We have to be at the forefront of advocating for a systemic educational change for our nation's public schools. If we're not there, I don't know how that's going to happen. We have a moral voice, and we have to raise it on that issue. And then finally, we can provide speakers, field trips, exposure to other role models to help expose kids to lots of different ideas in the world. And then this God encounter piece, that's the church, right? We should be out absolutely ensuring that our churches are reaching everyone that they need to in a way that's going to be relevant to them. Now, all of this might mean that we need to realign and reimagine how our churches, allocate time, how we spend our resources. We might have to get our hands dirty. We might have to partner with other community groups, learn more about educational issues if we want to tackle that work. And honestly, it might mean putting ourselves in uncomfortable places. And at the end of the day, it might mean changing our own lives, because there's a generation of kids that we're losing every year if we're not stepping into those spaces. So back to Jeremiah 29:11. We have to remember also, just as I wrap up, we have to remember the biblical context for this verse, both its history, what comes before it, and what comes after it. Otherwise, we get this text wrong, I would argue. And it actually leads to some pretty dangerous distortions. And again, in America, our context for this verse is often privilege. And as a consequence, I believe that we often conflate true prosperity and God's blessings with our efforts to guard our own privilege. I'm just as guilty as this as everyone. Part of the reason why this notion speaks to me personally is because I am a person who now has privilege. I may not have had it as a child, but I have it now. And I wrestle with this in the context of the very work that our organization does. But actually, the Jeremiah 29 context is actually the exact opposite. It's not privilege and prosperity, it's actually exile and ruin. The people of Israel have been beaten down, broken up. Prosperity is a distant memory for them at this point in Jeremiah. Hope is dim. The future doesn't seem very bright. In fact, the context is much closer to the situation in places like where I grew up, modern-day Detroit, which is what this is a photo of. It's often more resembling broken down buildings, abandoned, burned out shells of old factories, and shattered dreams for its residents. It's in this setting that Jeremiah actually calls on the people to remember God's promises, though. He reminds them that true prosperity isn't about big mansions and, beach homes for me and mine, but God's prosperity is actually a shared prosperity, even in the midst of exile. And it happens in the context of seeking the peace and welfare of the city. Jeremiah 29:7 says, "Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." This comes right before Jeremiah 29:11. And I think it's often easy to forget that this happens right before this verse because we want to jump to 29:11 because it's so awesome. But this is really what God is calling us to remember and to focus on. And too often our definition of prosperity boils down to seeking God's blessings for our own welfare. But Jeremiah breaks in and reminds us that God's blessing is inextricably bound to the welfare of others. It's bound to helping for us to help those who have been historically disenfranchised and marginalized find their purpose and their prosperity. And in finding theirs, helping them find theirs, we usually find ours as well. Thank you so much.